Now it's official. So everyone, I want to welcome you to the final guest lecture here at the Belfast Summer School for 2021. I am very excited to introduce this afternoon's speaker. I've had the pleasure of knowing Georgina Homer as a student of ancient Greek, and I'm delighted to see her working so hard on completing her PhD at Coventry University. She's working under the supervision of Judith Mosman and Daniel Anderson. Okay, so heavyweights in their field for sure. Georgina graduated with her BA in 2017 and her MA in 2019 in classical studies from the Open University. She was subsequently awarded a studentship to embark upon her doctoral project. Her research is primarily focused on the cinematic and the televisual reception of minor characters in Greek tragedy. Today, Georgina will present her paper on the afterlives of Euripides' unstaged princess. We're honoured to have her. I'm especially delighted to have her. So without further delay, I'll hand over now to Georgina and give her a big welcome to Belfast Summer School this year.
Brilliant. Hi, everyone. So I'll get straight into it, I think. So my research looks at on-screen receptions of minor characters from Greek tragedy. I have a twofold approach. Firstly, investigating the minor characters within the context of the plays, before moving on to their receptions and allusions within on-screen media. My ultimate plan is to look at some characters individually, whilst grouping and investigating others as categories such as messengers and nurses. One character who I have researched in some depth is the princess in Euripides' Medea, whom, only appearing in the famous and gruesome messenger speech, has no action, no speech, nor a name in the 5th century text, and yet she has a curious afterlife and has been amplified as a character for almost 2,500 years. In Euripides' Medea, the princess is a victim of Medea's revenge because she married Jason, leaving Medea husbandless and facing exile. Consequently, she dies a most dire death at the hands of Medea, as narrated in the messenger speech. However, it could be argued that she is not a character at all. Can we call a figure only spoken about with no physical presence a character at all, for instance? This has led to some scholars suggesting that she is indistinct, simply an anonymous figure hovering on the fringes of the action. A counter to this stance may ask whether there is such a thing as being simply anonymous in Greek tragedy. It is an investigation beyond the scopes of this paper for now. However, it is not unreasonable to presume that every character or figure within the extant tragedies are there for very good reasons. In the case of the Euripidean princess, I believe her anonymity is anything but simple, and maybe an essential part of her characterization as a respectable woman. The not naming of women was, after all, a common convention in Athenian society, from Thucydides' famous funeral speech of Pericles to oratory and other examples within tragedy. Thus, this is not an isolated example. Conversely, David Shapps tells us that disreputable women are more often named. What is fascinating about this figure, who does not seem to have been known at all before Euripides' time, does acquire a name in later scholia and summaries. This name is Glauce, a name which has remained almost consistently ever since. However, she also has a Latin name, Crusa, used by Roman writers such as Ovid and Seneca. The name is a generic feminized version of Creon, which means king. Therefore, they are essentially naming her princess. Interestingly, Hyginus actually refers to her as both Crusa and Glauce. Where the name Glauce originated, although attested as her name in scholar and hypotheses, has not been looked into in great much detail. Well, not until my thesis anyway. However, after a significant amount of research, it is possible the early mid-4th century playwright Carcinus the Younger was the first to assign the name. This name itself does have origins before Euripides, from the adjective glaukos, meaning clear, bright, or gleaming, and suggesting a freshness of youth. It was most often assigned to young daughters, brides, and nymphs as early as Hesiod. This name is important because it is used many times after Euripides in versions of the Medea myth, including in 2 of the 3 on-screen versions that I will talk about shortly. The fact that the princess already sees a transformation by being given a name serves to show that there is something to be gained in studying her further evolutions and afterlives. Although there are some excellent examples of the princess's reception in ancient receptions, I'm going to move directly to her portrayal in films and TV. In 1969, Pier Paolo Pasolini produced his version of the Medea, which encompassed his own views on bourgeoisie capitalism and a clash between two cultures with opposed views of reality, those being primitivism and rationalism. The film represents a Medea who comes from a primitive and sacred land, whilst Jason embodies the bourgeoisie with no care of the sacred and a move towards the modern. The film is inherently occupied by oppositions and doubling, and it also asks the fundamental questions of whether Medea had done anything wrong. It is in this vein that we find an interesting character in the Princess Glauce, who, amongst other things, is subjected to 2 deaths. The first of her death scenes is essentially a dreamlike sequence, as Medea imagines and foretells Glauce's death. In the scene, the princess accepts the deadly gifts from Jason and the children, as we see in Euripides, and instructs her handmaidens to prepare me. They dress her in the robe and headpiece, and comparable to Euripides, she gazes at herself in the mirror, smiling at her lifeless image. Many of her preceding actions also mirror the 5th century play, including how she frantically runs out of the town walls, the golden crown sending out an unbelievable flow of all devouring fire. Burning, she falls to the ground, overcome by misfortune, and her father falls upon the corpse and burns alongside his daughter. The imagery here heavily draws on Euripides, whereas in the second death, there is a significant divergence from the Euripidean plot. Preceding her actual death, the princess is seen sat in her quarters, staring wide-eyed, looking anguished. Her father enters the room, and a serving woman quickly wipes away tears from the girl's eyes. "What a beautiful bridal gown," he says to her, but she does not respond, continuing her wide-eyed glare, and he quickly leaves. In the next scene, we see a very similar thing to what we see in Euripides, when the king visits Medea to tell her that her and her children must go into exile, before actually allowing Medea an extra day to stay in Corinth. However, his reason for doing so is given more weight in Pasolini. He says, "I am not banishing you out of hate or out of suspicion because you're so different, a barbarian, come here with the markings of another race on you, but rather out of the love for my daughter who feels remorse towards you. She knows that you are suffering and she suffers too. This marriage with Jason, Medea, has become the source of anything but happiness." As I mentioned above, the film questions Medea's culpability, and it is significant then that Pasolini has the Creon character differ so greatly from Euripides' king, who doesn't trust her. He is more concerned with the unhappiness that Glauce's sympathizing is causing his daughter, and it would seem that he is right to feel this way, because in her actual death scene, Glauce appears to commit suicide. Compared to the imaginary death, the scene is much faster paced. There is no footage of her being dressed. Instead, it cuts away to Creon looking sullen before cutting back to a dressed, teary Glauce, gazing at herself in the mirror. The scene then quickly cuts away to her running into the palace grounds, swiftly followed by her father. The pair briefly exchange looks, and his expression is fraught with concern and realization. The princess runs again, her father following her, and flees up to the top of the palace walls before leaping to her death. Her father reaches the same point, briefly looking down upon her body before jumping himself. Both die in the same way, just as in Euripides. However, Pasolini seems to give them a choice in their death. They are not simply dying from the poison, from the effects of Medea's magic. Instead, in a sense, their deaths mark escapisms. Glauce, unhappy with the situation she finds herself in, needs to escape the marriage or the pity she is feeling for Medea's plight, whereas the Creon character is escaping life without his daughter, or with the guilt of knowing that he was party to the events that ultimately killed her. Interestingly, some may regard this death as occurring because the gifts from Medea are actually attacking Glauce's mind, driving her mad enough to jump. This argument, I believe, fails to factor in the subsequent death of her father in meeting the same fate as his daughter, a trope of Euripides and subsequent adaptations. Arguably, she may have been affected by the curse, and then her father committed suicide out of grief or guilt. But I personally think that this is an unnecessary ambiguity that does not have a place in the narrative. Pasolini already kills them both in the same manner in the dream sequence. It would therefore stand to reason that he would replicate this in the second death. For these reasons, and the clear unhappiness of Glauce and her father's own words to Medea, it is clear that the princess commits suicide. The ramifications of this are interesting as it abolishes some of the guilt on Medea's part, but it also establishes a once minor, unstaged character as a figure with presence and agency, who not only develops the plot, but redefines it. Just get to the water. Almost 20 years later, in 1988, the Danish filmmaker Lars Von Trier made his version of the Medea for Danish TV. As a TV film, it straddles between the two forms of on-screen production styles. It is no secret that he based his production on the unrealised screenplay of his late fellow Dane filmmaker Carl Theodor Dreyer. And it was the only time that Von Trier had ever worked with a script that wasn't his own, the only film he ever made that was adapted from a literary source, and to date, the only film with an historical narrative. Within the film, the role of Glauce is somewhat limited. However, she is a fully fledged character who holds genuine agency in the narrative, most prominently during the wedding night scenes with Jason. One very noticeable thing about Von Trier's Glauce is just how young she is. To me, she looks like a child. After lots of research, I've not been able to find out how old the actress was when she played her. She seems to have gone off the radar completely after appearing in this film. But to me, she looks very young indeed, particularly in comparison to the actor Udo Kier, who plays Jason, who would have been about 44 at the time. After the wedding ceremony, the newlyweds are carried off to a small island. Upon it stands a makeshift tent with a bed. There is a palpable tension as Jason lays his young bride down, looming over her. He gently strokes her face before more forcibly placing his fingers inside her mouth. As a childlike Glauce lays there with her eyes closed, the audience are waiting for the scenes we are all too familiar with, where new husband controls the consummation of marriage, the clear age difference making this scene all the more distressing. However, Glauce stops him. She grabs him by the wrist and removes his fingers from her mouth before standing up and withdrawing behind some curtains. Then a fascinating conversation ensues, which actually derives almost directly from the script of Carl Dreyer and essentially cements this Glauce not as the passive princess we hear about in Euripides, but as a woman who is taking control of the one thing she can, her body. Speaking of the events at the wedding, she says to Jason, "You had so many words for the elders, and yet none for me," a sign of her frustration at being treated as a non-entity. Her strategy, reminiscent of Aristophanes' Lysistrata, is to withhold sex, telling Jason that he cannot have her until Medea has left. The princess takes the control further as she is seen from the other side of the curtain getting undressed and teasing her new husband with the sight of her naked silhouette. It is interesting that this is not the only sexually charged scene in the film. In another scene, Medea also takes charge, attempting to seduce Jason. Both scenes show a deliberate choice to have these women take back some control in situations where they have very little. As the Glauce scene progresses, Jason clutches at his new bride through an almost translucent curtain, grabbing at her in an attempt to seduce her. Her serving women cover her with a sheet and giggle at Jason's advances. The heightened sexual tension is an interesting dynamic and gives two separate dimensions to the scene. Firstly, it explicitly shows the audience that Jason's attracted to this very young princess. This is important when we consider some of the aspects of the Medea story, where Jason remarks that this was a marriage of convenience, not of lust. Here, however, his animalistic behaviour towards his new bride leaves no doubt at all about some of the intentions towards her. Secondly, and most poignantly, is Glauce's intentions in creating this tension between them, to ensure Jason compels Medea to leave. This characteristic, associated with the princess character, is not seen elsewhere, and is a show of strength, and more importantly, one of personal agency. Glauce utilizes her body to entice Jason, exploiting his aroused state to manipulate him. Von Trier's Glauce creates her own agency. She does not accept the fate of being a young bride at the mercy of her older husband. Instead, she sets the ground rules, using her power as a woman to put Jason firmly in his place. Full-length features are not the only on-screen format that we find receptions of Greek tragedy. And in 2015, the BBC commissioned a TV series written by Mike Bartlett called Dr. Foster. It follows the protagonist, Gemma Foster, a GP, who discovers her husband, whom she shares a 14-year-old son called Tom, has been having an affair with 23-year-old Kate, her husband being called Simon. It proved popular, attracting 9 to 10 million viewers per episode, and a second series was commissioned in 2017. The series is loosely based on Euripides' Medea, and Bartlett was no stranger to the play, having written and directed a version for the stage in 2012. However, unlike the play, in this televised version, he did not feel the need to remain close to Euripides, telling me, "I was aware of setting the world up with the similar cast of characters, but beyond that, I let the story take its own path." With that in mind, then, it is an interesting example of reception to explore, and particularly in terms of its minor characters, like the other woman. Unlike the 5th century play, Kate is not killed. Actually, nor is Gemma and Simon's son, who represents the children in Euripides. This is a fairly significant adaptation to the 5th century play, and it therefore begs the question of her role within the series and what happens to her character. Mike Bartlett remarked, "I'm always interested in taking tropey-like roles, like the beautiful, silent, younger other woman, luring the audience in with them, and then turning them on their head." We are not actually aware of who the other woman is until right at the end of episode 1. She eludes the protagonist, who never guesses her identity, although she tries to find out, until it is revealed to her through finding images on Simon's phone. Thus, she starts off as an anonymous character, much like her counterpart in Euripides. However, the once hidden mistress does not stay that way for long. In episode 2, Kate makes an appointment at Gemma's doctor's surgery, but Gemma switches so that she can see Kate herself. Remember, at this point, Gemma does know that Simon is having an affair with Kate. In the scene, Gemma asks her if she's having sex regularly, and she replies, "Not enough. He's married, but unhappy. It's sad, actually." Her remarks are not only audacious, but could also be seen as a play for power. Within her relationship at the moment, it is clear that she probably has little to say in terms of when she can see Simon, for example. Perhaps this is her way of gaining back some of the control, telling his wife without really telling her. As we saw, this is comparable to the power play in Lars Von Trier's Medea, where Glauce insists on Medea's exile before she will consummate her marriage. The scene does take another significant divergence from Euripides at this point, as Gemma performs a pregnancy test and discovers that Kate is pregnant. This is interesting. Instead of killing her off, a pregnancy arguably brings her closer to the protagonist than in the 5th century play. This child would be her son's sibling after all, and this idea of bringing the two women on a more even keel is prevalent throughout the series. For instance, I often notice that in the Medea narratives, there is an unspoken association between the protagonist and the princess character, a likeness in characterization, personality, and often background. For instance, in Ovid's Heroides 12, where my thesis looks at how, in describing herself and her background, Medea is also describing her love rival. This is perhaps more evident in series 2 of Dr. Foster, however. One characteristic that is perhaps more evident in series 2. However, one characteristic that is noticeable is the comparability of the women's intellect and cunning, a known trope of Medea. Throughout Dr. Foster, Gemma is consistently conspiring and devising plans to catch Simon out, and we see this same type of cunning in Kate also. In episode 3 of series 1, she falsely tells Simon that she has had an abortion because he didn't leave his wife as he had promised. This initially leads to Simon ending things with Kate. However, by the end of episode 4, they are once again back together. Although it looks as if she hasn't told Simon that she is still pregnant, because in the series finale, after a showdown involving Gemma announcing their affair and her abortion to Kate's parents and Kate hitting Gemma, Gemma notices Kate holding her stomach. She says, "You're still pregnant. You didn't drink wine at the table. She was testing you, she says to Simon, to see if you wanted her or the baby. And you passed, went back, well done. Kate's deceptive yet astute test for Simon has paid off, and he chooses her and the baby. And at the end of the series, we see a heavily pregnant Kate telling Gemma that she and Simon are moving away for a fresh start. Ultimately, after a lot of drama, including Simon attacking Gemma and thinking she had killed Tom, Kate gets her man and Gemma signs the divorce papers. The ending to the series is very Euripidean, in that although Simon begins his new life with Kate, he loses his family, his job, and friends, having been ousted for his behaviour. I'd like to briefly talk about series 2. I don't have so much time to go into too much detail, but it does need saying that Kate's character becomes a different figure in the second season. The once younger other woman is now a wife and a mother to 2-year-old Amelie. The character's growth and maturity are pivotal within the narrative, and it shows in the control and strength she finally has within her relationship. In essence, Simon's life with Kate is now predicated on him being a good husband and father, and the audience discover this when Kate finds out that Simon has cheated on her with his ex-wife. Their expensive new home, his new business, everything he now has been provided by Kate's dad in order to ensure that his daughter gets the life she deserves. But when Simon cheats, it's all taken away from him. Kate's dad says to him, "It was made very clear to you from the beginning that all of this whole life is my daughter's, and you get to live in it while she's happy. The moment she's not, it snaps back." Simon's behaviours, his actions, have led to this moment, to the moment when Kate seizes all control and takes back her life. "You knew the deal. It was all there," she said. "You just had to manage being normal for 2 years, making a go of it. It all could have been yours, the house, the business, everything you ever wanted. You just had to love me and your daughter and not mess it up for 2 years. Dad always said you would, and I told him he was wrong. You're never going to see Amelie again. We're all moving to France." In this series, as in the first, Simon loses everything. He once again loses his family and finds himself ousted because of his behaviour. Kate becomes more than the other woman, and in many ways she becomes the new Medea in series 2, a symbol of power and female authority, as she realises that Simon cannot be trusted. She arguably shows the greatest character journey, from other woman with little power in her relationship to a woman with strength who wields all the power. In this fairly brief overview, I'm afraid, of how the once unstaged, unspoken, non-dramatis personae princess of Euripides Medea is received and reworked into later receptions, it becomes clear that she is a figure who has once one of the most flexible and adaptable roles. In later adaptations, she not only becomes a character in her own right, she becomes symbolic of how these writers and filmmakers adapt and manage this 2,500-year-old story, giving it new meanings that fit their agendas and contemporary worlds they are producing in. She is a key example of why we should not only look at the minor tragic characters more closely, but why we should further this by taking note of them in their later reincarnations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georgina. That was brilliant. That was really interesting. And I know now that we have some time for people to ask questions. You do have the ability to unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question directly. Otherwise, you can pop your question into the chat box and I'd be happy to read it out for you. No problem to Georgina. I have a question coming in already, I think. I'm just going to have a look. I was going to ask one, but I can see there's a few coming in straight away, so I'll give way to our guests instead. You've referred mostly to, this is from Derek, you've referred mostly to Euripides Medea as the focus of reception, but you also briefly mentioned similarities to the princess as she appears in the Heroides. Could you speak a little bit more about that if you have the time?
Yeah, so what I looked at in Ovid's Heroides, and I'm not sure many people have picked up on it, but the way that the letter is kind of formatted is it talks a little bit about Medea and her life, being young and where she comes from. And then she quickly mentions this new princess and her life and where she's come from. And there's these really key parts which kind of connect to each other. So I was a princess, my dad was the king of this land. And the same thing can be seen when she talks about Crusoe too. So it's kind of my understanding from the reading that actually I think Ovid is trying to make these connections between the two princesses, if you like. They are kind of one and the same. And overall, I think he's trying to show that there's not much variance in Jason's choice of women. And it's kind of backed up when you go back to Herodes 6 as well, which is Hypsipyle's letter to Jason. And the language in there is so similar also. So I think there is this kind of thing that Ovid is playing with, saying that Jason is, he's a bad guy that goes for these women, these types of women every single time. And yeah, so it's a bit more detailed than that in my actual thesis, I promise, but that's kind of, the brief idea of it anyway.
Yeah, there's a stereotype, there's a figure there that we're
definitely
seeing. And I love that with tragedy. You see it with comedy as well. You have these kind of stock characters coming into play, and they might take on different shapes in different versions of different plays, or different authors might shape them slightly differently, but there is kind of the usual features that do appear for these kind of characters. Joanna's asking, is there a nurse figure in the Dr. Foster series? Maybe a best friend or a go-between?
There are a few, I would say. There's a friend she works with, and then a friend who lives opposite. There's also another woman that she kind of gets help from in the Dr. Foster series, and she gets to go spy on Kate for her. So the nurse characters it's a bit like they've expanded the nurse character into the chorus as well, because the chorus of Euripides Medea is a chorus of women. It's the Corinthian women. So I think he's kind of taken this idea of many women together and given her these kind of tools to Gemma in Dr. Foster as well. So there are definitely nurse type characters.
That's really interesting to see. Like the chorus, we think of the chorus usually as maybe one voice, but as it was staged, obviously you have different characters there that are representing the chorus. So to see it broken down that way by a modern adaptation is quite a novel way to approach it, and probably makes it more digestible for a modern audience as well. So I really like that approach. What about the name? I mean, we've got a comment in here saying the meaning of Creusa is new, is very enriching. You mentioned the fact that this was a common kind of taboo in ancient Greece, not to name, particularly in Attica, I should say, not to name women specifically, respectable women at least. Could you comment a little bit more on that and how that impacts kind of your reading of Euripides as a result, and how we're trying to get, or how you're specifically trying to get to these figures?
Yeah.
That we don't have much on the page, but we do find so fascinating. I know myself when I'm reading oratory and we hear these women are mentioned, but we don't have their voices, but yet it opens the door to thinking about what were their lives like, whether in reality or whether it's part of myth and literature.
Yeah, I can't say I've thought much about the real lives of these types of anonymous women, but I think there's definitely some comparison to be made with the real lives of women and the women's that are, featured in these tragedies. To start with, I didn't notice this anonymity being anything kind of to do with real life. It kind of came to me all of a sudden. It's like, wait a minute, we don't name women. They don't name women. It's kind of it's a thing in Athenian society. So I looked a bit more into it and found a couple of people that have written about, the social lives of women in Athens, as much as we can know about the social lives of women in Athens. And it became quite clear that, this is a woman that's not supposed to leave the house, for starters, compared to, say, Medea, who announces that she is leaving the house. So that's why she can't appear on stage, because the palace is not shown on stage, for starters, so they don't need an actual character, and that she's not named at all. So it kind of, for me, it kind of fitted this idea of what we think at the moment the social lives of women might have been like in Athens, particularly when I read Shaps, and he was talking about in the courtrooms and how women were often just kind of described as being, such and such his wife, such and such his sister. It kind of, it struck a chord, I think. I think there's definitely more work to do there, and it's definitely something somebody should work on anyway, I think.
Absolutely. The fact that these are mentioned and we get to hear their side, or we don't get to hear their own voices come through, whichever the genre is. It's something that I myself am fascinated with as well. And we're so curious about the things that are not spoken, the things that are not lifted. Commenting from Bill, I found it interesting that the alternative death in the movie was leaping from the wall. Lots of princesses die that way in order to save their city. So again, another kind of feature that we see and kind of being used and manipulated in different ways.
Yeah, I haven't thought about that actually. Sorry, I don't know much about the princesses leaping from walls, but that's something I think I will need to look at. Yeah, I think of reputable women hang themselves, don't they? I think most often, particularly in
that's usually that's the kind of dramatic way. And for men, then it's normally poison, isn't it?
Yeah.
Or by the sword. So yeah, straight away I'm going to Demosthenes, of course, but you have that usual kind of male way to commit suicide, and then the feminine then hanging is, I suppose, the most reputable way to commit suicide if you're a respectable woman that way as well.
I've never thought about princesses leaping from walls, so I might have to look into that a bit more because I don't know much about that, I'm afraid. Sorry.
Would anybody else like to ask a question? Please feel free to unmute yourselves or raise your hand. I'm sure I'll see it come up in the notification if anybody else would like to pick Georgina's brain on this even further. Would you recommend, while your bibliography is on screen there, would you recommend anything in particular for people to follow up with their reading on this if they've been...
Well, to start with, you need to watch these things. I think a lot of people don't watch them because they're worried that they're not going to be true to the kind of the original tragedies, but we need to watch them with an open mind and think about them without considering their closeness to the tragedies, because that's not the point of them. They're there to enlighten us about our own times, or certain times if you like. And there's the connections between the tragedies and them. It's really, really interesting. After that, if you're interested in Pasolini, Bet, she's good, and Borgeson. There is some amazing kind of books just in general on reception. So if you're interested in Medea in performance, then Medea in performance 1500 to 2000, I've got it up there as well. That's a brilliant book. And Greek Women on Film, that's another really good one if you're interested in the lives of women from these tragedies and how we've kind of reinterpreted them into the film.
This is all, of course, until we're waiting for your PhD to come out, and we're all going to be flicking the pages, breaking the spine of that to know more. Alexandra's asking, a lot of Greek stories are being turned into novels recently. Absolutely, there's a huge fashion for that. Has the princess popped up in any yet?
Well, she does appear in Christoph Wolff's Medea. Actually, she's got quite a big role in Christoph Wolff's Medea. She's it's different. She has a relationship with Medea in that, so I highly recommend that as a novel. It's really good. I can't think of anything else that's more recent than that in novels. It's a difficult one to do, I think, Medea, because of killing children. It's not it's not the nicest.
It's a hard one to take, isn't it? Yeah.
So I think that's why we don't see them on the page so often. As much as
it's hard to create that empathy with Medea that you want in a main character that you want to understand, and it's exactly. As much as Euripides is successful in creating some sort of pathos and understanding her situation, you do kind of see it from a modern perspective. You can't help yourself in thinking about the act that she does as well.
Yeah, exactly. I think it works better on stage because you can remove yourself from it a bit more. I think stage isn't real. I think film becomes more real when you kind of engross into it and you see aspects of your life in film because of the way they make it. So I think that
absolutely, and whether or not it's actually staged, whether you see the death of the children or whether that's included visually either on the stage or in a screen, seeing the death of the children themselves is quite powerful. So whether that's removed or whether it's just implied as part of the staging production as well is there. Megan, are there any examples of Iphigenia or Electra in movies that you've seen, and how are they, if so?
So Electra and Iphigenia. There is an Electra film by Kakionis. I haven't seen it yet. It's on my list.
To-do list.
Yeah, I've been rewatching, these films too many times over the past kind of 6 months. Another film for Iphigenia, which is based on Iphigenia I can't remember which one it is, but it's Killing of the Sacred Deer.
Yes.
It's a really new film, and it's got Colin Farrell in, I believe. It's on my list as well. Okay. I'm working kind of systematically through different characters, basically.
As your research is progressing.
I'm trying not to bombard myself, because like when you do reception, you have to do all the scholarship around, you know, the original text, and then you have to move to all the scholarship around all of the like the new versions and the adaptations, and there's a lot.
Peeling back the layers, yeah.
Exactly. So I kind of focused on Glauce. I'm currently working on Messengers at the moment, but Iphigenia is definitely one that I want to look at, particularly looking at Killing of the Sacred Deer, because I've heard it's a phenomenal film.
So it's a future talk for Belfast Summer School that we can look forward to as well. Joan has mentioned that Pandora's Jar, Natalie Haynes, does write about Medea. So if anybody's interested in that element, you can pick up there with Natalie Haynes's fabulous book. Another question from Derek: how do the various films handle the departure of Medea via the dragon chariot?
None of them have her leaving via the dragon chariot. Pasolini has her on the roof of a house, having set fire to her entire house. And it kind of ends with the sun really bright in the background, obviously replicating
that imagery.
And it kind of just ends there. So we don't really know what happens to her. She might have an apotheosis, or she might, you know, just die in the burning house. It's not sure, and I think Pasolini wanted to keep it that way, you know, kind of ambiguous. Lars Von Trier, it's really a Viking-esque film. It's so Nordic, and actually she goes off on a boat. So yeah, there's nothing like that in Dr. Foster, because it's you know, it's set in a market town. Not too far from London.
Having dragons swoop in would kind of ruin that kind of illusion that it's set up for the realism and the suspense.
Exactly. Instead, they have her kind of they have her going to help someone because she's the doctor. So you know, she's in the middle of the marketplace with her son having a coffee, and then someone really needs her help, and she goes off to help them, and then that kind of ends like that. It's like, you know, happy ending. In series 1, that is. Series 2 is a bit different. But yeah, it's kind of series 2 actually is quite dramatic. Tom leaves her son, he runs off, and it's quite depressing at the end actually. So yeah, so no chariots, I'm afraid, with dragons. Much the pity.
That's it. Yeah, loads of people are saying how interesting this is. Kirsten is saying, have you looked at the stage adaptations as well, or is that some part? Have you reached that part of your research, or is it mostly the television and the cinematic that you've looked at so far?
So it is something I've looked at in the past. It's something that I have, you know, flitted in and out of. But film is kind of is my primary focus, and it will be for my whole thesis. Maybe sometime in the future I might, but I've looked at a few, but nothing to any great detail. I'm better at reading films, so for me, I'm just going to stick with TV and film for now.
So that would be the second book in the series that we're going to be looking forward to. We're planning your career out as we go with these questions. This is fantastic.
And then maybe radio after that. Radio adaptation.
Absolutely, yes. There've been some recently here by Irish Radio. I must send you the links as well. That there've been a couple of plays that have been done by the Greek playwrights. So I must send you the link for those, as again maybe the third book in the series that you're going to do.
Yeah, and of course, and all the online plays as well, like you know, the recent one from King's, but also War Productions, is that what it's called? I think they put them on all the time, and they have really famous faces like Frances McDormand and things, and they're fantastic. I highly recommend anyone watching those. I guess I could write about those because technically it's on a screen.
An appendix.
Yeah.
Yeah, Kirsten mentioned she's asking because in Medea in Los Angeles, Creon and Glauce are made the same character. So that's an interesting take on that one. So that might be
across. Yeah,
that might be something to look at in the future.
I need to make a note.
Copy it down quick. I'll take this opportunity just to ask, is there any more questions that anybody wants to ask before I release Georgina from the grilling we're giving her here and telling her what her future publications are going to look like and what we want her to work on? Is there anything that anybody would like to ask? Otherwise, it's my pleasure once again just to thank our speaker for coming here to close off our lecture series. And on a high as well. We couldn't have asked for better to wrap up the 2021 programme. It's been superb to have you here, to have such a really interesting topic to finish up with, something that I'm sure everybody now will be looking into, Googling either adaptations or going back to Dr. Foster and watching it with new eyes. I certainly will. And I think Joanne said the same as well. We're definitely going to be looking at that with, I watched it and never made the connection. So I definitely have to go back now and
lots of people
try to put those threads together and see exactly what you're talking about there for myself. So without further ado, we'll let Georgina off the hook then. And we thank her once again. I'm sure that the virtual claps will come through. Yeah, they're going already. So thank you, Georgina, once more. And we're wishing you all the best of luck with your future research. We can't wait to read about it. That's what we're hoping to see on a bibliography soon in the future as well. So best of luck with your studies. And thank you so much on behalf of Helen, myself, and the fellow tutors at the Belfast Summer School this year. We're really grateful that you came along today and ended our series for us.
Brilliant. Thank you for having me. I've had fun. I was a bit nervous, but I've had fun.
Not nervous at all. Future scholar to watch, a star in the making. So we can say we've had you first. So thank you to everyone for attending once again. Thank you for those of you who are guests, who are past students who are coming back. Thank you to the current students who not only have had 2 classes this morning, but are in their second week of studies. So thank you all for sticking it through. We have one more day of classes left, but this is our final workshop or guest lecture for this series. So we're delighted. I know the students are exhausted. The tutors are definitely exhausted. So thank you all so much for sticking around and participating all week with us. And thank you absolutely to Georgina once more. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.